The wood of the floorboards was the only sky he knew for a long time, and that sky was a suffocating canopy of yellow pine and dust. It didn't begin with a scream or a struggle that would have alerted the neighbors. It began with the mundane, terrifying sound of a heavy iron latch clicking into place. That click was the sound of a world shrinking, the sound of a human life being edited out of the sunlight and into the damp, lightless geography of the crawl space. When you're 10 years old, the world is supposed to be an expanding horizon of fields and creek beds. But for this boy, the horizon became the width of his own shoulders. He was pushed down into the dark, a space originally intended for the passage of cold air and the nesting of spiders, not for the slow, agonizing passage of a childhood. Down there, the air doesn't circulate. It merely sits, growing thick and heavy with the scent of stagnant humidity and the sharp, acidic tang of the cedar rot that ate at the foundation beams. For the first few hours, he must have waited for the door to open again, his eyes straining against the darkness, so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against his eyelids. But the door stayed shut. The silence from above was even more terrifying than the dark below. He could hear the muffled rhythm of a life he was no longer allowed to touch. The scraping of a chair in the dining room, the distant chime of a grandfather clock, the dull thud of footsteps that sounded like thunder to someone living in the dirt. He learned to read the house by its vibrations, a primitive language of movement transmitted through the joists. He knew when the family was eating because the floorboards groaned under the weight of the heavy oak table. He knew when the mistress of the house was angry by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of her leather heels in the hallway directly over his head. He was a ghost before he was dead, a physical presence tucked into the architecture of the home, like insulation or a forgotten tool. The crawl space was a narrow strip of earth, barely 3 feet high at its deepest point, tapering off into a suffocating squeeze where the brick piers met the floor. In this space, time doesn't move forward. It just accumulates like the dust motes that occasionally filtered down through the cracks when the sun was high. He had to learn the topography of his cage by touch. The texture of the hand-fired bricks, rough and cold. The feel of the packed clay earth that never truly dried. The splintered edges of the support beams that had been hewn by men who looked just like him. Every inch of that space became a map of his survival. He found the one spot where a knot had fallen out of a floorboard, a tiny circular eye that offered a distorted glimpse into the world of light. Through that hole, he could see the hem of a dress or the occasional glint of a silver spoon, fragments of a reality that seemed increasingly like a dream. The confinement was a slow-motion erasure. Each day that passed without the latch being lifted was a layer of his identity being stripped away by the darkness. He wasn't just hidden, he was being unmade. The physical reality of being locked under a house is a constant battle with the senses. The ears become hypersensitive, the skin craves the friction of a breeze that never comes, and the mind begins to loop, replaying the last moments of freedom until they lose all meaning. He was the secret the house kept in its belly, a living heartbeat trapped in a ribcage of wood and stone. The house was not merely a structure of wood and mortar. It was a psychological weapon, an architectural manifestation of a hierarchy that demanded total submission. In the antebellum South, the grand estates of Georgia and the Carolinas were designed to project an image of effortless grace, with white columns and sprawling porches that suggested a civilization of refinement and law. But this elegance was a thin veil draped over a brutal, clockwork machinery of exploitation. The system that put the boy under the house was the same one that dictated the price of cotton and the legality of a human soul. To understand the place, you have to understand the logic of the people who built it. They viewed their property, both the land and the people, as a single, manageable unit. If a tool was broken, it was discarded. If a person became a complication, they were hidden. The crawl space beneath the parlor was the physical manifestation of the social basement of the South, a place where the unpleasant realities of power were stowed away so they wouldn't ruin the view from the veranda. The system of slavery relied on the absolute control of movement. To be enslaved was to have your geography dictated by another person's will. But this confinement went beyond the usual boundaries of the plantation or the kitchen. It was a domestic incarceration that turned the very concept of home into a dungeon. The architecture itself was complicit. The brick piers that held the house above the damp soil were spaced just far enough apart to create a labyrinth of shadows, a subworld where the laws of the sun did not apply. In this ecosystem, the boy was a hidden variable in the household's ledger. The family above him didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as stewards of an order that required certain things to stay in their place. To them, the boy wasn't a child in pain. He was a disruption that had been successfully contained. This was the banality of the system. It didn't require constant cruelty to function, only a total, unwavering indifference to the humanity of those beneath the floorboards. As the years stretched on, the house itself seemed to absorb the boy's presence. The wood seasoned with the moisture of his breath. The dust settled in patterns dictated by his movements. The owners walked across the floors with a terrifying nonchalance, their footsteps a constant reminder that they owned the air he breathed and the dirt he slept on. The system provided no recourse. There were no inspectors to peer into the dark corners of a private residence, no census takers who cared about the head count in the crawl space. The law stopped at the front door. This was the ultimate power of the master, the ability to create a pocket of reality where a human being could exist for years without ever being present in the eyes of the world. The house was a fortress of silence, protected by a legal and social framework that celebrated the sanctity of the white domestic sphere while it practiced a quiet, slow-motion execution in the shadows below. His name has been scoured from the ledgers, bleached out by time and the deliberate neglect of those who held the pen, but his existence is a haunting weight in the history of the South. We know he was young when the darkness took him, a child whose bones were still growing, whose mind was still forming its first coherent maps of the world. In the records of the era, he might have been boy number 4, or simply a loss mentioned in a fleeting letter between cousins. He was part of a generation born into a status where their very breath was a taxable commodity. His mother, perhaps sold to a plantation in the Mississippi Delta or worked to death in the same fields he once saw from a distance, was a memory that eventually became as thin as the light under the house. The trauma of the domestic slave trade was a ghost that haunted every nursery in the quarters, a system that treated the bond between parent and child as a temporary inconvenience to be managed for profit. In the dark, he became a master of a different kind of knowledge. He knew the taste of the different types of soil, the sandy grit near the exterior vents and the heavy, metallic clay of the interior. He knew the life cycles of the beetles and the silverfish that were his only companions. His body adapted to the cramped dimensions of his world. His muscles grew lean and coiled. His skin grew pale and translucent like the roots of a plant reaching for water in a cellar. He was a testament to the terrifying resilience of the human spirit. To survive in such conditions is not an act of hope, but an act of pure, stubborn defiance. Every breath he took was a refusal to vanish. He would hum to himself, tiny vibrations that barely left his throat, just to hear the sound of a human voice in the crushing silence. He was a repository of a culture that was being systematically erased. The songs, the rhythms, and the stories of a people who were told they had no history. His confinement was not just physical, it was a psychological siege. The owners tried to turn him into a non-entity, a shadow that didn't require a name or a future. But he remained a person. He felt the cold of the Georgia winters through the cracks in the stone. He felt the stifling heat of the summers when the earth itself seemed to sweat. He had dreams that the floorboards above him would one day turn to water and he could swim upward into the light. These internal worlds were the only places the system couldn't reach. While his body was held captive by the architecture of slavery, his mind was a vast, unmappable territory that they could never fully colonize. He was the silent witness to the family's private lives, the one who heard their whispers and their cries, the one who knew the truth about the refined people living above him. He was the most dangerous person in the house because he was the only one who saw it for exactly what it was. The investigation into the boy's disappearance didn't fail. It was never truly initiated, and that distinction is the core of the tragedy. In a society where the law was built to protect the property rights of the powerful, the disappearance of a young enslaved boy was seen as a private administrative matter rather than a crime. When the neighbors noticed his absence from a yard or the kitchen, the questions were asked in passing, over tea or during a carriage ride, and the answers provided were always designed to end the conversation. He was sent south, they would say, or he succumbed to the flux, and in the social etiquette of the 1850s, to press further was to commit a breach of decorum. The local sheriff, a man whose salary was often supplemented by the very planters he was supposed to oversee, had no interest in peering into the crawl spaces of a tax-paying citizen's estate. The legal apparatus of the time was a sieve, designed to catch those who ran away, but perfectly shaped to let those who were hidden slip through the cracks. There was a collective, unspoken agreement to look away. This wasn't a conspiracy of whispers so much as a conspiracy of silence. Every official who might have intervened, the circuit judge, the local constabulary, the slave patrollers, belonged to the same social class as the family in the house. To investigate the disappearance of a piece of property was to challenge the absolute sovereignty of a master over his domain. If one man's house could be searched for a missing boy, then no one's home was safe from the prying eyes of the law. Thus, the boy remained under the floor not because he was expertly hidden, but because the world above had decided he was no longer worth seeing. The investigation died in the polite nods of the townspeople and the blank lines of the county sheriff's logbook. It was a murder of the record before it was a murder of the boy, a systematic closing of eyes that turned a kidnapping into a mere footnote of bad luck. The lack of inquiry acted as a second cage. Even as months turned into years, and the boy's name began to fade from the memories of the other enslaved people, who had their own tragedies to manage, the official world remained resolutely indifferent. There are no warrants in the archives, no depositions from the house servants, no rewards posted in the local gazette. This absence of action is a chilling testament to how easily a human being can be deleted when the state decides they don't count as a person. The authorities didn't need to be bribed to stay away. They simply didn't see a reason to come. The boundary of the house was a border that the law refused to cross, creating a zone of total impunity where a child could be kept in the dirt while the community played music and discussed politics just a few feet away. The investigation stopped because the system worked exactly as it was intended to. It protected the secret keepers and erased the secret. The true history of the American South is not found in the grand speeches or the marble monuments, but in the white space of the ledgers where the boy's life should have been. While the plantation owners were obsessive record keepers, noting the weight of every bale of cotton, the cost of every gallon of molasses, and the pedigree of every horse, they were equally meticulous about what they chose to omit. The boy under the house became a nonentity through a process of deliberate clerical neglect. In the family Bible, where births and deaths were recorded with somber piety, his name never appeared. In the bills of sale and the probate inventories, he was a ghost, a missing asset that was eventually written off as a loss without further explanation. This was the paper-thin wall between existence and oblivion. If you weren't on the list, you didn't exist in the eyes of history. This erasure was a form of violence that lasted long after the physical confinement ended. By not recording his presence, the family ensured that no future generation could easily point to the crime. They understood that the written word was the only thing that survived the rot of time, so they denied him even a single ink stroke. There are no letters home because he was never allowed to learn to read or write. There are no census markings because he was hidden during the count. There are no death certificates because his body was never officially found. We are left to reconstruct his life through the negative space, the stories that aren't told, the names that aren't mentioned, and the physical anomalies of the architecture that suggest a space was used for something other than storage. The history of the marginalized is a history of fragments, and the boy's life is the most fragmented of all. Even the oral traditions of the time struggled to hold on to him. In the slave quarters, where news traveled through song and whisper, the story of the boy under the house might have been a terrifying cautionary tale, but even those stories are subject to the erosion of time. Without a grave to mark or a name to speak, a person becomes a myth, and myths are easy for historians to dismiss as folklore. The family's refusal to record his existence wasn't just about avoiding a scandal in the 1800s. It was about controlling the future's ability to judge them. They were editing the moral landscape of their own legacy, removing the stain of the boy before it could dry. What we are looking at when we study this case is a void, a carefully maintained silence that speaks louder than any confession. It is the sound of a pen being held back, a deliberate choice to let a human life be swallowed by the blankness of the page. Silence in a house like that isn't just a lack of sound. It's a living thing that feeds on the truth until there's nothing left. For the boy, the silence was a deafening, constant companion, broken only by the rhythmic, agonizingly normal sounds of the family above. He heard the silver clinking against porcelain during Sunday dinners. He heard the laughter of children his own age playing tag in the yard. He heard the low, murmuring prayers of a family that considered itself godly. The contrast between the light-filled world of the parlor and the cold, damp silence of his prison was a psychological torture that never relented. To the people above, the silence was a shield. If they didn't talk about the boy, if they didn't acknowledge the scratching beneath their feet or the faint, muffled cough from the foundation, then he didn't truly exist. They trained themselves to hear the house's groans as mere settling, rather than the movements of a captive child. This silence was a communal effort. It extended past the walls of the house and into the surrounding town. People have a remarkable ability to ignore what would make their lives uncomfortable. The neighbors might have noticed that the young boy who used to fetch the water was no longer seen, but they also knew the reputation of the master of that house. They knew that in this world, asking the wrong question could lead to social ruin or worse. So they practiced a polite, lethal indifference. The silence became a heavy fog that settled over the entire county, obscuring the truth so effectively that even the people involved began to believe their own lies. It wasn't a secret that required an oath. It was a secret that required only a lack of courage. The boy was buried in the air long before he was buried in the earth, suffocated by a society that preferred a quiet lie to a loud, ugly truth. Within the crawl space, the boy's own voice eventually failed him. When you speak to no one for years, the very mechanism of language begins to rust. He might have started by whispering his own name to the spiders, just to keep the sound of it alive, but eventually, even that must have felt like a futile exercise. The silence of the house eventually became his own silence. He became a creature of shadows and vibrations, a human being reduced to a set of survival instincts. This is the ultimate victory of the oppressor, not just to take the body, but to take the voice to ensure that the victim cannot even articulate their own suffering. The silence was the final layer of his confinement, a prison within a prison, making the world above feel like another planet entirely. He was a witness to a world that had collectively decided he was invisible, and in that silence, his humanity was expected to simply evaporate. The preservation of this secret was not an act of madness, but a calculated maintenance of power that paid dividends in both social standing and psychological dominance. In the economy of the antebellum South, the master of a house was the absolute sun around which all other lives orbited. To admit to a crime as grotesque as the permanent confinement of a child would be to admit a crack in the divine order they claimed to represent. The family benefited from the boy's disappearance because it reinforced their reputation as people who could make reality bend to their will. By making a human being vanish without a trace, they sent a chilling, unspoken message to every other enslaved person on the property. I can erase you. I can make it as if you never were. This fear was more effective than any whip or chain, ensuring a level of compliance born of the terrifying realization that the law offered no protection once you crossed their threshold. Beyond the psychological leverage, there was a grim, practical benefit. In the twisted logic of the era, an enslaved person who was dead to the world but still physically present was a resource that existed outside the scrutiny of creditors, tax assessors, or heirs. He was a shadow worker, a ghost in the machinery of the household who could be used for tasks that required total discretion. But the greatest benefit was the preservation of their own souls, or the hollowed-out versions of them they presented to the world. By successfully hiding the boy, they maintained their status as pillars of the community, as God-fearing Christians, and as noble leaders of a society built on the backs of the broken. They traded a boy's life for the comfort of their own conscience, convinced that as long as the secret remained under the floorboards, it remained outside the judgment of man and God. The community at large benefited as well, though in a more abstract and insidious way. Every time a neighbor looked the other way, every time a local official ignored a rumor, they were reinforcing the stability of their own world. If the master of one estate could be held accountable for the treatment of his property, the entire foundation of their wealth was at risk. The silence was a collective insurance policy. By allowing the boy to remain in the dirt, they were protecting the right of every slaveholder to do as they pleased behind closed doors. The benefit was the maintenance of a status quo where the powerful were never truly questioned, and where the disappearance of the inconvenient was simply a cost of doing business. The boy's suffering was the fuel that kept the grand engine of Southern society running smoothly, a hidden sacrifice made at the altar of white supremacy and domestic autonomy. There's a moment in the life of a captive where the outside world stops being a destination and starts being a hallucination. For the boy, the point of no return was likely not marked by a single event, but by the slow, agonizing realization that no one was coming. Years of breathing the same stagnant air and tracing the same brick patterns had rewired his brain to accept the crawl space as the only true reality. The sky he remembered became a myth, a story he told himself that he eventually stopped believing. This is the ultimate cruelty of extreme confinement. It doesn't just take your freedom, it takes your ability to imagine being free. His muscles, long since adapted to the crouch and the crawl, would have felt like a betrayal in the open air. His eyes, accustomed to the eternal twilight of the foundation, would have found the sun to be an enemy rather than a savior. By the time he reaches late teens or early 20s, still trapped, still unrecorded, the person he might have been had been completely hollowed out. The trauma had become a structural part of his identity, as permanent as the brick piers that held up the house. Even if the floorboards had been ripped away and the light of 1,000 torches had flooded his prison, he was already gone. The point of no return is the threshold where the damage becomes deeper than the remedy. He had witnessed the family grow, heard their children's voices change from high-pitched chirps to the deep, authoritative tones of adulthood. The very adulthood he was being denied. He was a man-child of the dark, a biological miracle of survival that had been stripped of every social and emotional tool needed to exist in a world of people. This transition from victim to part of the house is the most somber chapter of the story. He no longer scratched at the wood with the same desperation. He no longer whispered his name to the spiders. He became a creature of pure, silent observation. The injustice had become so total that it was no longer an event. It was just the weather. It was the way things were. This psychological surrender is what allowed the silence to last for so long. He had stopped being a prisoner who wanted to escape and had become a secret that had accepted its own concealment. The tragedy was no longer that he was being kept, but that he had been changed into something that could no longer remember why it shouldn't be there. The house had won. It had absorbed his spirit into its foundations, leaving only a heartbeat in the dirt. Time is the ultimate collaborator in the erasure of history. As the decades rolled past, the Civil War came and went, the system of formal slavery was dismantled, and the South began the long, dishonest process of rebranding its past. The house where the boy was kept either burned in the fires of Sherman's March or fell into the slow decay of the Reconstruction era. With every year that passed, the physical evidence of his confinement grew more faint. The wood rotted and returned to the earth. The scratch marks he had made in the bricks were smoothed over by moisture and moss. The people who knew the truth, the masters who locked the door and the neighbors who looked away, carried their secrets into the silent earth of the local cemetery, their headstones praising their virtue and honor. The process of forgetting was active, not passive. The lost cause narrative was being written, a myth that painted the Old South as a place of chivalry and mutual affection between master and servant. In this sanitized version of history, there was no room for a boy kept in a crawl space. His story was an inconvenient jagged edge on a smooth, polished lie. So the community continued to do what it had always done. It chose the comfortable silence. New families moved into the area. New roads were paved over old plantation paths, and the local archives were reorganized in ways that conveniently lost the records of the most egregious abuses. The boy wasn't just forgotten. He was paved over by the collective will of a society that needed to believe it was better than it actually was. Today, that spot of land might be a suburban backyard, a parking lot, or a patch of woods that no one visits. The earth has a way of swallowing trauma, turning the sites of unspeakable suffering into mundane landscapes. But the erasure is never quite perfect. The silence that the family cultivated for years has a peculiar resonance that sensitive historians and the descendants of the enslaved can still feel. It is a coldness in the air, a sense of something missing from the story. We are currently living in the after silence, a period where we know something terrible happened, but the specifics have been bleached away by a century of sun and rain. The boy's life has been reduced to a vibration in the soil, a haunting what if that challenges the easy stories we tell ourselves about the past. He is the ghost that the American record cannot exorcise because it refuses to name him. What remains is not a grave, not a monument, and certainly not a formal apology from the institutions that allowed it to happen. What remains is a profound, unsettling void, a hole in the American story that is exactly the shape of a 10-year-old boy. This case, and others like it that were never recorded, serves as a grim reminder that our history is not just made of the things that happened, but of the things we were successful in hiding. The injustice was never corrected because the system that created it was never truly held to account for its most intimate cruelties. There is no closure here, no satisfying ending where the boy is rescued and the villain is punished. There is only the long, cold shadow of a truth that was kept in the dark until it withered away. The discomfort we feel when we look at these empty spaces is the only justice that is left to give. It is the refusal to let the silence be comfortable. By acknowledging that a life was lived and lost in the dirt beneath a family's feet, we are performing a late, imperfect act of witnessing. We are saying that he was here. We are saying that his heartbeat mattered, even if it was only heard by the joists and the stones. The physical traces might be gone. The house a memory, the bones part of the Georgia clay, but the moral weight of his confinement remains. It is a debt that the past can never pay back, a reminder that the refinement of our ancestors was often bought with the currency of absolute, unblinking cruelty. In the end, the story of the boy under the house is a story about the boundaries of our empathy. It asks us how much we are willing to ignore for the sake of our own peace of mind. As we walk over the ground of our history, we must realize that every silent field and every peaceful historic home might be hiding a story that was never meant to be told. The boy is still there, not as a spirit, but as a challenge to our conscience. He remains in the gaps between the words of our history books, a silent passenger in the narrative of a nation that is still trying to learn how to speak the truth about its own foundations. The only thing we can do is refuse to look away, to sit in the discomfort of the dark, and to listen to the silence until it starts to sound like a name.